Welcome back. Today's talk is titled When You Can't Communicate with Their Armor, or Defense Wins Championships, Not Relationships. In an earlier talk, we brought up that concept of defense mode. That moment your suit goes into autopilot and you're not consciously piloting anymore. You're not really aware, you're just acting from protection. And defense mode can range all the way from mild irritation to blind fury, where everything is a big effing deal, man. Everything gets inflated, everything becomes urgent, everything gets personal. There can be this moment in the communication that becomes very difficult because you realize you're no longer talking to the person, you're talking to their protection, to their armor, to their suit. You are talking to the defense mode. And this can be very hard to recognize in real time because the other person is still there. Their face is still in front of you. Their name is still on the screen. The words are still coming through. Technically, the act of conversing is still happening, but something has shifted. You say something honest or authentic and it doesn't quite land right, so you try to clarify yourself. Then the clarification lands wrong too. Now you're trying to explain your intent, but your explanation sounds defensive to them. Then they react to the defensiveness and you react to being misunderstood. And suddenly the original truth is gone. And now the conversation is about what happened. It's about the reactions. It's about the threat. It's about protection. It's about old machinery inside both people trying to regain safety. And at that point, you're no longer really having a conversation. You're two activated nervous systems wearing the costume of conversation. And this is the part a lot of us miss. We think communication is mostly about language. We think if we can just find the right words, the other person is going to understand. If we can explain it more clearly, more logically, more gently, maybe if we're a little more careful, then the truth will finally get through. And sometimes I have to say that does work. And sometimes it doesn't. Because sometimes the problem's not the sentence, it's the delivery. The problem is in the state. A person in a calm state can hear nuance. They can say, oh, I see what you meant. They can separate the intent from the impact. And they can make room for a little complexity. But a person in a threatened state, they only hear danger. They hear, you're trying to manipulate me. You're trying to control me. You're trying to tell me that I'm wrong. You're trying to make me the villain. You're trying to tell me I'm bad. A threatened nervous system categorizes everything into one underlying message, and that's a blaring alarm. And when the protection system has taken over the microphone, truth has to pass through the security before it reaches the person. And unfortunately, a lot of the time it does not make it through because you are not talking to the person anymore. You are talking to the guards at their castle walls. It's like a king or queen inside a castle. That is the actual person. The part that can listen, reflect, repair, and meet you. But when the system feels threatened, the drawbridge goes up. The guards climb up to the top of the wall, the archers take their positions, and now you're standing outside the castle trying to explain yourself to a defense system whose only job is to keep danger out. And in that moment, the perceived danger is you. So you can say the most reasonable, loving, carefully worded thing in the world, but the guards do not hear love. They hear breach. They hear threat. They hear the enemy's at the gate. And this happens constantly in relationships. Someone says something vulnerable, and the other person hears it as criticism. Someone sets a boundary, and the other person hears it as abandonment, control, or being bossed around. Someone asks for space, and the other person hears it as rejection. Someone tries to repair, and the other person hears it as, oh, you're just trying to control the narrative. And if you've ever been in that kind of conversation, especially over text, you know how insane it can feel. You choose every word carefully. You soften the sentence. You remove any part that sounds too sharp. You try to be as honest as possible without being too harsh or combative. And yet somehow they still respond to the one thing you were trying so hard not to say. And it's not because you actually said it, but because that's what their armor heard. And then both people are arguing about meanings that were never actually said out loud. And this is why so many conversations fall apart, because both sides are no longer responding to the present moment. They're responding to the meaning their nervous system assigned to the present moment. And that meaning is being filtered through old patterns, old data, old protection strategies, old relationships, old shame, old betrayals, old childhood material. All are being dragged into the room and dressed up as this current conversation. And this is where it gets tricky, because when you are the one who feels clear, it is very tempting to think, I am communicating authentically and this person can't handle my truth. And that can be partly true, but it can also be a trap. Because the ego loves to turn awareness into superiority. The ego loves to say, look at me. I'm calm. I'm conscious. I'm trying to communicate. They're defensive. They're reactive. They're in their armor. But the moment you start using awareness as a weapon, you're in your armor too. It may be prettier armor. It may have spiritual language on it. It may sound like maturity, but it's still armor, and underneath it is the same old wound. Why can't you understand me? Why can't you see what I mean? Why can't you meet me here? And I know that one all too well. There's a very specific kind of pain in being misunderstood when you're trying to be honest, especially if you've spent your life feeling like you have to explain yourself in order to be safe. Especially if you learned early on that being understood was not just nice, it was necessary. So when someone misunderstands you, it does not feel like a small miscommunication. It feels like a threat to your very essence. It feels like, after all this time, how could you think that about me? And then your own armor comes online. Your own defense mode activates. Now you're not simply clarifying, you're defending your own essence. You're not just saying, this is what I meant. You are saying, please see that I am not the person that fear has turned me into in your head. And that is where the conversation becomes practically impossible. Because now both people are trying to get safety from the other person, while the other person is also trying to get safety from them. Two people needing reassurance from each other in the same moment, while neither has the capacity to give it. And that is the sound of metal scraping metal. One suit of armor talking to the other suit. And nobody has to be trying to hurt the other person for this to happen. But the other person is not the one speaking anymore. The protector is. And the protector does not care about truth in the way that the heart cares about truth. The protector cares about survival. The protector cares about not being exposed, abandoned, blamed, trapped, made to feel wrong, or being seen in a way that feels uncomfortable. So what can you do when you realize you're talking to the armor? The first thing is probably the hardest. You've got to stop trying to force the deeper conversation. Because the difficult reality is the other person in that state may not be able to hold it. And this realization can save so much energy. Not every true thing is speakable in every moment. Not every person is available for the conversation underneath the conversation. Not every misunderstanding can be repaired while the alarm is still ringing. Sometimes the cleanest thing to say is simple. I think this hit differently than I intended, and it doesn't feel good right now. I don't think we're in the right state to talk about this clearly. And then you stop. That's not weakness or avoidance. That's not losing the battle. It is recognizing that truth needs the proper container. And when the container is full of threat, truth gets distorted. This can be very difficult for people who are articulate or good with words. Because if you're good with words, you can convince yourself that there's just one more sentence that will correct it. One more explanation. One more clarification. One more perfect landing. Like a pilot trying to land a plane in a storm. But sometimes love is not finding the perfect words. Sometimes love is knowing when more words are just feeding the fire. And again, this applies both ways. It is very easy to see when somebody else is in their armor. It is much harder to see when we are in ours. Their armor can look like defensiveness, while ours looks like clarity. Their armor can look like a projection, while ours looks like an explanation. Their armor can look like avoidance, while ours looks like persistence. Their armor looks like ego, while ours looks like truth. But if you feel a tightness in your chest, or a sense of urgency, or this feeling of, I need them to understand right now, or I cannot rest, then you probably are not as free as you think you are. You're activated. And activation is an invitation to change the conversation. And this brings us back to the simple question. Can this person hear me right now? Clarity does not always equal capacity. And can I say this without trying to control the outcome? It also brings us back to that saying, it's not what you said, it's what they heard. Because they are reacting to what they heard. What their system heard may be old. And the same is true with us. We are not always reacting from the content of the sentence in front of us. Sometimes we are reacting to old material too. Sometimes we're trying to prove that we are good. Sometimes we're trying to prove we're not who someone thinks we are. So when the conversation starts moving in a direction that doesn't feel right, the solution is not always to speak louder, cleaner, or longer. It is not always to search for one sentence that changes everything. Sometimes the conscious choice is to stop wrestling with the armor. You can understand where the armor came from and still choose not to keep wrestling with it. Sometimes the most honest communication we can give is space. Sometimes it is letting someone keep their own interpretation without feeling like it is your job to correct their inner movie. And this can be absolutely brutal when you desperately want to be understood. Because if your peace depends on somebody else understanding your interpretation, then your peace is now trapped inside their nervous system. And this is a very unstable place to hide your peace. The deeper practice is being able to say, I know what I meant. I can clarify once, but I do not need to force my truth through a closed door. That is clean. You are not withdrawing from intimacy. Real intimacy requires communication. It requires repair. It requires vulnerability. It requires a willingness to hear uncomfortable things. But real intimacy also requires enough state awareness to know when you're not actually speaking to each other anymore. When the armor is up, the goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to stop making it worse. Otherwise, you get trapped in a Chinese finger trap, where the more you pull, the more tightly ensnared you both become. And later, if both people can relax and open up, maybe then conversation can happen. Maybe you can say, here's what I meant. And they can say, well, here's what I heard. And maybe then both of you can stay human. That is the dream, at least. But there's a big difference between a defensive moment and a whole relationship built around defense. One can be repaired. The other starts becoming a whole weather system that you live in. And if the opening is not there, you cannot create it by force. You cannot communicate someone out of a protection state if they are committed, consciously or unconsciously, to staying protected. You can notice it. You can soften your own grip. You can even refuse to let your own armor take over the response. But you cannot make them hear you. And that part hurts, because sometimes you can still see the person underneath the armor. You can still see the heart. You can still see the wound. You can still see the scared thing inside them swinging a sword at the shadows. And still, none of that means that your life is supposed to become some sort of permanent battlefield. And that is where people often get confused. They confuse compassion with staying. They confuse understanding someone's protection pattern with volunteering to live inside it. They confuse love with endlessly standing there, trying to prove their heart to someone who keeps hearing every honest word as an attack. But at some point, if every bridge becomes a battlefield, you have to stop pretending the bridge is still open. At some point, if every truth you offer has to fight for its life before it can even be heard, you have to ask what the relationship is actually asking of you, because you cannot build a home inside someone else's armor. You can visit, you can knock, you can speak to it clearly, you can even wait for the visor to lift, but you cannot crawl inside the suit with them and call that intimacy. And sometimes that's a curriculum too. Not explaining more, not proving yourself one more time, not becoming more patient, more articulate, more gentle, more spiritually mature until you finally discover that one magic sentence that finally gets through. Sometimes the curriculum is standing up. Sometimes it is saying, I have said what I can say. I have owned what is mine. I have clarified what I can clarify. And I'm not going to keep sacrificing my nervous system to a conversation that cannot hear me. Maybe the bridge can be rebuilt later. Maybe it cannot. But you do not have to keep walking onto a battlefield and calling it love. Defense may win championships, but it does not build relationships. And when the armor becomes the relationship, sometimes the most honest thing you can do is leaving the battlefield with your heart still intact. So with that said, be kind to yourself, and I'll talk to you again soon.